Greetings to you all, praises to the Most High, and job blessings. I am Dr. W. Gabriel Selassie I, the revolutionary historian. I'm making this video because I've received quite a number of requests from individuals who've asked me to try to explain why is it that seemingly there are lots of people throughout the world that hold blacks in such low esteem. This question was generated from the new revelations that Gandhi made disparaging remarks about Africans and black people. And so the question was that it seems that even if people like Gandhi held such poor views of black people and the seeming level of racism that we see in the world today, that it seems like this was a historical fact for all times. And I'd like to say that this is actually not true. Black people were actually held in high esteem for most of our world's or human population or evolution. It wasn't until the 15th century, with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, that actually black people, Africans in particular, were held in such low regard. And there is a justifiable reason for this, and I'll explain how this actually occurs. And I'll give you some information that you can later take back where you can do your own research that will kind of sort of help you to begin your own research. I always kind of believe that people, once they get information, it's best that you should do your own research as well. And the limit that we have to do this video really forces me to exclude a lot of things that I'd like to talk about, but I'll just hit the very basic points for you. The first thing that we need to get a hold of is the idea that black people, Africans, were fully integrated into European society before the 15th century. And I'll give you a couple of examples to this. And one of them is that in Roman society, it was heavily integrated with Africans as part of the mainstream culture within the Levant or within Roman society. So the importance of that is that in many cases, Africans were seen not as debased people, but people who were held in high regard. Septimus Servus was a Roman emperor, and his family ruled over Rome for a large number of years. Queen Charlotte Mecklenburg was the wife of King George, who was the King of Great Britain at the time of the American Revolution. She was of African descent. So there were time periods and certainly examples that we can draw upon that clearly indicate that there was a deep and respectful, heavy African influence in Europe. So the thing that we can draw from this is that Europeans had a solid and historical context to draw from in relationship to black people. So then where did the denigration of black people actually come from? It actually comes from the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, here is the thing that we have to remember. As the transatlantic slave trade was in full force and they were developing plantations not only off the coast of Europe, but in the West Indies as well, Europeans who had visited some of these plantations were startled by the overall barbaric conditions that the other Europeans forced these Africans and indigenous Indians into. The conditions were so horrific that many people began to question the morality of slavery and the slave plantation system. An individual who lived in the 18th century named Comte Buffon actually wrote and said that it was probably immoral to enslave Africans and then not to compensate them in some type of form of property for their labor. So people fundamentally understood that the slave trade was in fact, and slavery was in fact, an immoral enterprise. Now think about this for a moment. If someone was questioning how you made your livelihood and the money that you were generating was so great that you didn't want to give up that enterprise, the next best thing to do was find a justification to enslave those that you have enslaved. Now, planters themselves could not spend a lot of time writing and figuring out these justifications. Who did this were a group of physicians who were what we would call naturalists. They called themselves natural philosophers or natural historians because they studied nature. Now, these naturalists, who were primarily physicians, studied not only humans, but they also studied animals and plants, right? So if you're studying nature, it's obvious that you're going to make inquiries about the flora and fauna that reside in your area. So these naturalists had spread out all throughout Europe, and they had pretty much, by and large, figured out all the different types of plants and animals that existed within the European geographic region. The problem with this is that as people began to explore greatly outside of Europe, they were being introduced to a whole vast number of new plants, new species, and in some cases, new races of people. Now, these naturalists, these early scientists, did not know what to do with this information because they essentially didn't know what to deal with this. Now, I'm going to stop here and just back up for one moment because I need to explain something that's really important that'll kind of tie into this. Now, the reason why Europeans were exploring is simply for trade. The Europeans, since the time of Marco Polo, had known that to the east there was a vast empire known as China, where they could in fact trade and bring in a lot of spices into Europe. And these spices were heavily prized and heavily valued by the European elite, and lots of money could be generated by trading in these spices. The problem with that is that as the Islamic empires began to grow, they challenged Europeans over these trade routes and essentially cut off those trade routes. And so the Europeans needed alternative avenues towards the east. The land routes were closed, so they looked to water routes or the ability to travel west by water to get to the east, and that was essentially what Christopher Columbus's journeys were. You probably learned that in school. But here's the thing. As these ships were going out and either discovering new lands or discovering new people and bringing things back, the Europeans were amazed at just a vast number of goods or plants and animals and even people that they were now discovering. And so why this is important is that if you read the Bible, which most Europeans did, they considered themselves Christian, and Europe was a heavily Christianized society. They believed in the Bible, but the stories of the Bible did not fundamentally square with their notions about these other people and other plants that they discovered. For example, if you followed the story of Adam and Eve, they believed that the Garden of Eden was somehow somewhere in Europe, and so people would have essentially populated out from Europe. If you believed in the story of Noah's Ark, you thought that perhaps the Noah's Ark had landed on Mount Ararat, which is in Europe, and so you would have thought that the world was populated out from Europe. Well, then the question was, if you've discovered these new people in far-off lands, how in fact did they get there? If you discovered some type of bird species, the only thing that you could have acknowledged, well, a bird from Europe, from the Ark, must have flown all the way to these far-off lands, but that seemed almost to some as an impossibility. And how did the people get there? So, the biblical accounts of the population of the earth did not square with the fact that they were discovering these new people. So one of the things that they attempted to do was they placed aboard these ships, as time progressed, as new lands were being discovered, they placed these natural scientists aboard these ships with the sole purposes, as they were discovering new lands, to bring back new plants, new animals. Now, layered on top of this was that these voyages cost money, lots of money. So these wealthy royal families within Europe, and in some cases bank houses, were funding these expeditions, and so they could not afford to send out a ship and then have that ship come back without anything that they could actually use to sell in the markets. So these naturalists were very important aboard these ships to bring back plants, animals, etc., that could be eventually turned into commodities. So what you have then is that these naturalists who were essentially working for these royal families and these banking houses to essentially ensure that there were commodities that could be brought back to Europe for sale. Now, if you've ever watched the movie Mutiny on the Bounty, you'll understand that the one thing that they were trying to discover or they were bringing back before the mutiny occurred was breadfruit. And the reason why breadfruit, they believed that they could plant breadfruit and essentially feed slaves. If you ever saw Master and Commander of the Far Side, that movie with Mel Gibson, on board his ship was a naturalist, a scientist. So if you haven't seen those movies, you should probably look at them really quickly and you'll understand exactly what I'm saying. Now, when we go back just to our earlier point about the denigration of black people, as word was getting out about the horrendous conditions of these plantations, many of these royal families who had heavily invested in these plantations needed to find justifications for slavery. So they looked towards these natural historians who were discovering these new people to somehow figure out a moral justification to continue slavery. So in comes Carl von Linnaeus, who lived from 1707 to 1778, who wrote a book called Systema Naturae in 1735. Systema Naturae in 1735. What is important about this book is that Linnaeus developed a taxonomic system whereby all the plants and all the animals and even human species could then be categorized in some system of order. So, for example, if they discovered one type of bird in one location that was similar to another type of bird in another location, they understood using Linnaeus' system that these two birds were probably cousins or somehow belonging to the same species. Now, I'm going to give you really quickly a definition of species because that'll help us later. A species is essentially two hybrids that cannot mate. So a fish and a dog are two different species because essentially they cannot produce offspring. Now, what these naturalists did was, like Linnaeus, who developed this taxonomic system, is that as they were discovering new people, they began to place these new races of people within this taxonomic system. So Linnaeus' system that he developed divided the human races into categories. The first race that he came up with was Homo americanus, then Homo europaeus, Homo asiaticus, and then finally Homo afer. Right? So Homo americanus was an Indian, europaeus white, asiaticus yellow, afer black. Now, not only did he just name these individuals or categorize them, but he also gave them attributes. So, for example, Homo americanus, he said, was obstinate, contented, regulated by custom, bad-tempered. Asiaticus was yellow, grave, dignified, ruled by opinions. Homo afer, black people, calm, cool, cunning, lazy, lustful, careless, whimsy, governed by caprice, etc. But for white people, Homo europaeus, he wrote that they were fickle, optimistic and positive, blue-eyed, and governed by laws. So Linnaeus is the first person who actually described or categorized these races and then gave them physical and psychological attributes. The next person who comes in, who builds off of Johann Blumenbach's work is, Linnaeus's work is Johann Blumenbach, who lived from 1752 to 1840, who wrote a book called The Natural Varieties of Mankind. What Blumenbach does for us is that he provides our modern system of categorizing races. So if you ever have to fill out a job application or apply for college and you have to fill out what race you are, Blumenbach was the person who developed this system. So he developed the term Caucasian for the white race, Mongolian for the Asians, Malayan for brown race, the Ethiopian for the black race, and American for the red race. But Blumenbach did something even much more heinous. He not only developed the system, but he also began to rank them. So he placed the Caucasian at the top of the list, and then he placed the Indian and the Ethiopian or the black at the bottom. What's significant about that is that we know that through slavery, especially in the West Indies, blacks and Native Indians, indigenous Indians, were targeted for slavery. So by developing a hierarchy of the races, right, then what he could argue that since Indians or black people are at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, they are then deemed primary for slavery. Blumenbach believed that the Caucasian race was the most beautiful, and that probably Adam and Eve were Caucasian, and that Noah's Ark landed in the Caucasus region, and that's where all the races came from. So the idea that Blumenbach put forward was the idea that all other races are degenerate races out of the white race. These ideas spread quickly throughout Europe and eventually made it to America. And we see this in the writing of people like Josiah Nott, Thomas Jefferson, and the most infamous of all is Louis Agassiz, who lived from 1807 to 1873, who came up with the idea or the scientific theory of the Ice Age. But what's significant also about Louis Agassiz is that he described the idea of polygenism, that the races were all separate, that the white race came from Adam and Eve, but the other races, in particular the black race, was a separate species. So not only did he call for the idea that blacks were not humans, not of the same human species as white, but he insisted that laws should be made that would essentially exclude black people from the overall American polity because, in fact, they were a degenerate and debased race. And so with these scientific racist ideas, planters, slave owners could then look and say, look, Louis Agassiz, Johann Blumenbach, Carl von Linnaeus, Comte de Buffon, all of these individuals have articulated scientifically and have proven that black people are a degenerate and debased race of people and that they are not fit for civilization and therefore could in fact be enslaved. So this is the reason why, to the degree that these ideas are with us today. These ideas, for example, Louis Agassiz was actually a professor at Harvard and responsible for educating large numbers of people who actually went out and fanned out across America and spread these racist ideas that are still a permanent fixture of society. Many white people and many other people outside of the United States and Europe actually have bought on to these ideas that are centuries old and believe that black people and other groups of people like Native Americans are not as intelligent as, let's say, white people. So this is exactly where these ideas come from. Now, I'm going to conclude here because I'm vastly running out of time. But if you have any questions about this particular topic, feel free to email and I can lead you to where you can do your own studying with great books that were written by a large number of other people. All right, thank you for tuning in and look forward to another episode from Dr. Gabriel Selassie I, the Revolutionary.